This is Beyond a Reasonable Doubt with your hosts, Mark Garrigus and Gary Smith.
Hey, welcome to the first post-Adam era episode. And as promised, we're going to have some rotating guests and rotating hosts or hostesses. And today, Gary, who do we have?
We have returning guest, Sara Azari. Sara, welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Mark. Hi, Gary.
Hi there.
Okay, Sara, where are you? Are you in South Carolina, New York, or LA?
No, I'm in LA. I'm going to go to South Carolina next week.
Really?
Yeah.
Are you gonna collect on your bet with Eric Bland?
Yeah, I'll be going to dinner.
Eric, and for anybody who doesn't know, Sara has done more than her fair share of shows with this South Carolina legal malpractice lawyer, and who's very protective of his South Carolina state and anything related to it, to the point where he gets very offended by Sara. It's quite a show.
It's very interesting because, look, I give him credit for, you said it first. You said he has a dog in the fight, and that's absolutely true. He represents one of the many victims of Alex Murdaugh, who was lied to, conned, ripped off millions of dollars. And it was his housekeeper's son or two sons. And so obviously,
the housekeeper who died, by the way,
who died. No foul play as far as we know so far. But but it's interesting because he obviously comes from bias and a lot of feelings around this. And so Mark and I are trying to come in as completely removed criminal defense practitioners, talking about the process, talking about due process, talking about the rules of evidence. And he gets really upset, but he doesn't get upset at Mark. He gets upset at me. And then he asks me to dinner. And it's very confusing because I'm like, why are you asking me to dinner when you're so mad at me?
Well, I'm sure he is very upset with you, Sara, but I think Mark might be selling himself a little short. I've listened to a lot of Eric Bland content in the last 6 months or so, and I've heard Mark's name come up many times. It's usually a throwaway. It's not contentious, but it comes up.
Yeah.
By the way, for those of you who don't know, let me tell you, after whatever it was, 6, 8, 10 weeks of trial, the jury basically found this guy guilty in about 45 minutes after the judge removed a juror, which I will tell you, talk about a chilling effect on jurors about to deliberate. Brought not only the juror in and quizzed the juror, then brought in the people who supposedly talk with the jurors. It was obvious that somebody was out to get this juror knocked off. And boy, they came back. I know the people, I was watching something today or listening to something, somebody was saying, well, how could they select a four-person, deliberate, and do all that in 45 minutes? And it said, Sara brought this fact to it. In South Carolina, they don't select the four-person.
Right. The judge selected the four-person, a woman, before trial started. But what's interesting, Mark, is that the SLED, the Agency of Investigative Ineptitude, which stands for, what does it stand for? The acronym? It stands for Law Enforcement Department. It's South. Is it? State Law Enforcement Department or something like that. And they were asked by Judge Newman to investigate these statements that this juror may have made outside of court about her position on the verdict. And
by the way, can I just call timeout for 1 second? How do you, in a trial where you're charging a guy with a double murder and the whole defense is based on basically slamming SLED. Right. Then during the jury, right before they're going to deliberate, you have the very agency which the defense has been slamming investigate the supposed juror misconduct.
Right. And that there's a lot of that going on, Mark. And what's interesting is that
Judge they don't call it SLED?
South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. Yeah, South Carolina Law Enforcement. Judge Newman today in the sentencing hearing, there were no victim statements. Obviously, this is family dynamics. They don't believe he did it. They don't believe he's the killer.
Yeah. By the way, right. I was just going to say, by the way, for all the people who are championing the victims, the one victim, the remaining surviving son, passed out outside of the courthouse today because he was so upset by this. So yeah, I don't know who you're.
So the judge, there were no victim impact statements, right? So he made up for the void. And then he asks the chief of SLED to make a statement. And I'm like, how is SLED the victim? They're the victim of their own ineptitude. I don't understand how they're a victim of this murder. So he then goes on to say they've been maligned. And I'm thinking, Mark, look, every law enforcement officer, every agency knows that the minute they're called into a investigation, they have to treat it like it's going to trial. They have to cross their, T's and dot their I's, and they cannot do what happened here, right? So how are they a victim of this? It was so true. I mean, there's so much wrong with that. All due respect to every, honorable judge, out there, but I'm going to call it out as it is. I don't think I'm going to be before Judge Newman anytime soon. But I'm going to say that it was very personal. He weaponized the addiction. He said, oh, maybe you didn't commit the crime, but the monster, the addict in you committed the crime. Urged a confession. Our panel member a few minutes ago was like, that's the failure to be contrite. I'm like, he was urging a confession repeatedly. And the guy kept saying, I'm innocent. I mean, I've never seen that. I had prosecutors on my Twitter feed going, what? I've never seen this, that a judge presses for a confession.
Well, have you ever seen a sentencing one day after the verdict?
Yeah, right. By the way, they told me that in South Carolina, they do it very quickly. Like they should have done it last night, but they were hoping they're going to get victims in for impact statements. Then what else, Mark, he did? He said, oh, you changed your alibi. Okay, that was complete BS because when Murdaugh filed his notice of alibi in late last year, he said, I wasn't there. I wasn't there from 9 to 10 or whatever. But the prosecution waited until the last minute to file their timeline. So how do you effectively, put up a defense and an alibi when you don't know the critical time period, that matters, right?
Right. And for those who, because there will be the amen chorus who will just say, well, he's guilty. What does it matter? Blah, blah, blah. By the way, the whole idea of the system is to put the prosecution through their paces and hold their feet to the fire. And when you cut corners, when you are sloppy, when you do the kinds of things that you've been talking about, Sarah, that is exactly, by the way, if I had a nickel for every person who's ever come into my office when they or a loved one are charged with a crime and said, well, what about this? What about that? And say, yeah, well, you're the first one to either vote for the Victims' Bill of Rights or vote for this, cutting out of due process. And that's what you get.
And, the other thing too, Mark, was, last night we missed you on the panel, but Alan Dershowitz was on. And of course, I mean, he's a brilliant mind. And he brought up the issue that this appeal could be challenging just because Alex Murdaugh took the stand. Because of harmless error issues. I get that. I agree with that. But despite that, there are very, very fat bases for appeal. Now, whether it's going to get overturned or not is a different story. But
it's exactly, I was just going to say the whole idea of letting in the financial crime evidence is going to be the basis for the appeal. Now, make sure you understand what I'm saying. Am I saying that somebody's going to overturn this? I think it's highly unlikely right now based on the record. But that is what the record reflects, and that's what they will appeal. But I will tell you what makes more sense to me is they will do juror interviews, and the jurors will talk, and the jurors will say stuff, and you will inevitably find, I believe, misconduct. And if you find misconduct,
I think so, because think about it. This is a small town. A third of the jurors were dismissed because they simply raised their hands and said, we know him and or we know about all his misdeeds. So I cannot believe that there's then 12 jurors and then however many alternates who just happen to not know this guy in this, in this area where even the neighboring counties, I mean, they tried to change the venue. They could not find a venue where people didn't know the Murdaughs, right, in this area. So I'm not accusing any jurors of not being candid or forthright, but I bet you that some slipped in there that may not have raised their hands, right? And maybe talked about, I just, there's something to me intuitively that needs to be dug deeper with this jury. And there's also what I brought up earlier in our conversation was the Doyle issue, because on Alex's cross-examination, the prosecutor was not, and I was saying this weeks ago, Mark, on the panel, that it really wasn't about motive. This was the backdoor way for character assassination, like you said earlier. And, he argued at the end of the case, we don't have to prove motive. Motive is not an element. Forget motive. Because he really brought all that in and the judge opened the floodgate to assassinate his character, to make him look like a con man. And it was effective. And on cross, I'm sorry, the Doyle issue, on cross, when Alec testified, he repeatedly asked him about the lie. Why didn't you clear it up with Sled all of these months, right? Okay, up until his arrest is one thing. But he kept asking him since his arrest, why has he not come to law enforcement in an interrogative type of setting and then, clear this up? It's clearly Fifth Amendment. He doesn't have to meet with law enforcement after his arrest, So that's going to be an issue too, I think, because the judge objected profusely during
right.
that.
And the problem is nobody's going to touch this thing. No appellate judge is going to touch this unless they come up with something that is more novel. Exactly. Something that hasn't been there yet. Well, Sara, it's great having you. We're going to have you back.
Please.
I will miss doing shows with you every night. And
there's going to be something happening, right? There's going to be Idaho. There's going to be. We should talk about Idaho too at some point.
We will come back.
But yeah, we'll talk soon.
Okay. Thank you so much. Gary, what happened to you, Gary?
Oh, I'm still here. I've been listening along. I've been wondering, you guys were talking about the jury. Just one last question from an outside perspective. Is it unusual or noteworthy how many of the jurors we lost and how we ended up with, I believe, only one alternate juror when this trial ended, right? We had the one who wouldn't leave because she wanted her eggs, but,
I'll tell you, I think what you're going to find is that there's more to the issues of the Sled investigating and what happened there. I think there's more to that. I could be wrong, but I think that we'll hear about that in coming days.
Well, we'll be watching for that.
Gary, one thing, Gary, that the length of the trial was what was concerning, because then, remember, I think one or two of the jurors got COVID.
Yeah.
So lost two that way. And then, we had to excuse this one. So the longer the trial, the more the likelihood that you could lose jurors. And that's what happened. But thank God. Can you imagine having to go through this again?
Oh
my God.
It'd be horrible for everything but ratings. Sara,
exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed having you.
Weekend.
We'll have you back soon.
Thanks.
All right, take care.
Thanks, Gary. See you Sunday. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. Stay tuned for more bonus episodes coming soon.